Now, even though a lot of us dividend investors aren't necessarily the biggest fan of QYLD or the NASDAQ 100 covered call ETF, this ETF just as of recently paid one of the biggest distributions I've seen in a very, very long time. And because I do own several thousand shares of the ETF, it's definitely impactful to my portfolio. And even though over the years there are now, in my opinion, better NASDAQ covered call style ETFs across the market, I wanted to make another video about QYLD, sort of touch on what this ETF has been doing as of recently, and again go through how much this most recent massive distribution impacted my personal portfolio. So either way, whether you like this ETF or not, if you are a dividend or income focused investor, make sure to stick around, drop a like down below, and let's get right into this one. If you are a dividend investor who wants to level up your portfolio, you need to be tracking your dividend income consistently. And that's why I created the perfect dividend tracker that I've used to scale my dividend income up to all-time highs over the last year. Now, along with this dividend tracker, you're also going to receive my A to Z dividend investing ebook, which shows you how I personally started from $0 several years ago to now where I earn over $7,500 per month in dividends. So if you want this tracker and the ebook, go to the first link down below in my description and grab it today. Now, before we go through and I show you guys exactly how much I made off of this most recent payout by QYLD, which I'm telling you, it's pretty massive. I want to go through some of the basics about this ETF, explain how it works, because like I said, although it doesn't necessarily have the best option strategy in my opinion, it still does offer some nice exposure to a high quality strategy that I personally have been utilizing for years. So it says right here on the reasons to consider on the fact sheet, it says high income potential. QYLD seeks to generate income through cover call writing, which historically produces higher yields in periods of lower volatility. Now, QYLD is one of the first ever ETFs to utilize the cover call strategy. It isn't the first one of all time, but it's definitely up there in the OG category. And because I personally have been writing cover calls on individual names in my portfolio for years, when this ETF did come out several years ago, I spent quite a bit of money on shares in this one and built up a sizable position, which again, I'm going to share with you guys in a second. Now it says monthly distributions. This is another huge pro when it comes to QYLD. But again, nowadays there's tons of other ETFs that pay out monthly or sometimes even weekly. But to be fair, QYLD has been making payments every single month for 10 years running, sometimes a little bit higher, sometimes a little bit lower, but either way, very impressive. Now, lastly, it says efficient option execution. QYLD writes call options on the NASDAQ 100 index, saving investors the time and potential expense of doing so individually. Now, what this means is basically you could, of course, buy into the NASDAQ, you could write your own calls, but that's going to cost you several thousands of dollars to do so. And instead, you can buy a few shares of QYLD and get very similar exposure. Now, I also want to touch on what I said during the intro of this video. Some investors aren't necessarily the biggest fan of QYLD because of the option strategy. And what I mean by this is that even though this ETF is a NASDAQ 100 cover call ETF, just like a lot of other cover call ETFs out there that also utilize the NASDAQ, some ETFs are going to have option strategies where, for example, they sell cover calls out of the money or in the money or maybe at the money. And depending on what the actual strategy is, which all of you definitely need to do your own research and figure out whatever you're investing into, what is that individual ETF strategy? That's going to determine how much upside or maybe potentially not how much upside any individual cover call style ETF might have. Now, one thing that QYLD has always been very consistent on is it is a pretty basic strategy. This ETF buys into the NASDAQ, then sells an out of the money call option, holds onto it for a while. It's really not all that complicated, which once again hasn't necessarily allowed this ETF to flourish like other NASDAQ 100 ETFs in the same space. Now, what I mean by this is that even on the 1 year time frame where QYLD is up around 7.18%, if we max things out and look at the last several years, over the last decade or so, QYLD has lost around 27% as far as price return goes. Although to be fair, ever since 2022, this ETF has been on the up and up. Now, of course, if we include all the distributions that this ETF has paid over the last several years, which I'm also going to show you guys, this ETF has still not done bad whatsoever. But again, in the same exact category, different NASDAQ 100 covered call ETFs, other ones have done better. Now, to get into the fun part, looking at the most recent distribution that QYLD did pay, and this was as of December. So to give you an idea, QYLD over the last year or so has been paying anywhere from 16 cents per share per month, upwards to around 18 cents per share per month, which is not bad whatsoever. We're talking around a 10% more or less yield, maybe 11%. But then as of recently, the end of the year, we had a massive payout of 34 cents per share, which has not been something that we have seen all the way back since 2021. Now, with this 34-cent special payout, this basically gives investors like myself almost a complete extra dividend for the month of December, which is substantial. Now, also notable, because of this massive payout, this now gives QYLD a trailing 12-month distribution of around 12.96%, which now, if we're looking at the almost 13% trailing 12-month dividend yield, that makes this ETF even that much more attractive to some investors that might have not been as interested. Now for me personally, some of you guys might or might not already know this, but I currently hold around 2,746 shares of QYLD across my multiple portfolios with an average cost somewhere just below $20 per share. Now because QYLD is actually lower than that, I still haven't made back all my money as far as all my cost basis, but again, over the years, I've been paid several hundreds of dollars every single month. So again, this ETF hasn't been the best investment, but also not the worst. Now the craziest part of all this, because I own 2,700 and some odd shares of QYLD, and because of that 30+ cent payout that we're going to be receiving, I'm looking at almost $1,000 as far as distributions go for a single month when it comes to QYLD. Now also kind of crazy, if I were to take that money and drip it into more shares of QYLD, which I'm not going to do, but just for fun, I'd be getting around 51 shares of QYLD for absolutely free. So has QYLD been the best investment over the last decade plus? Well, the answer is definitely no. It's offered around 127% total return with dividends being reinvested, or around 7 or 8% on average per year. But to be fair, for investors like myself that have been collecting those monthly distributions, reinvesting them into different ETFs, whether it's more growth style or more dividend style, this ETF still has not done horribly over the last several years, and especially if we account for this most recent massive payouts, honestly it's making QYLD look a little bit better in my eyes. Now moving forward, am I personally going to add more shares of QYLD in my long-term portfolio? Well, the answer is probably not, because I already have around 2,800 shares. I might grab a share or two here and there in some of my smaller portfolios, but I do personally think that there's other better quality NASDAQ 100 covered call style ETFs across the market that I talk about all the time on my channel. But I think it's safe to say that still over the last decade plus, QYLD has not been the worst investment, not the best one, but I'm still going to hold on to it long term in my portfolio. Now lastly, before I go, I thought it would be fun to stack up QYLD next to JEPQ, next to QQQY, next to GPIQ, a few super high quality NASDAQ income focused ETFs that all more or less have somewhat of a similar strategy. Now on the 1 year time frame, if we were to look at total return as the metric, which is income plus price return included, on the 1 year time frame, QYLD is returned around 22%, where JEPQ is returned over 28%, QQQY has returned just over 21%, and GPIQ has returned almost 28%. Now, if I personally were to rank all these ETFs from best to worst, and I want you guys to also do this down below in my comments, I would say that either GPIQ or JEPQ is going to be number one. For this video's sake, I'll just say GPIQ, then JEPQ, then QQQY, and then QYLD. And like I mentioned, even though a lot of these ETFs have very similar strategies, and I definitely recommend you guys look into all these, for example, they do all have their own objectives and strategy that are definitely worth looking into. So now that we talked about QYLD, the NASDAQ 100 covered call style ETF, I shared with you guys the most recent massive distribution and how much they impacted my personal portfolio, along with sharing with you guys whether or not I personally am going to add more shares of this ETF in my portfolio. I lastly want to hear from you down below. Is QYLD an ETF that we're currently going to find in your portfolio? Let us know yes or no in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to please drop a like on it and subscribe for more future content like this. So if you want this tracker and the ebook, go to the first link down below in my description and grab it today. Thanks as always for stopping by, and if you are interested in investing, make sure to check out these recent videos I posted right here.